Stay in the hallway, my mother told me. Your energy is off today. She said it the way she always did, like it was a fact of nature, like the weather, like gravity. Then she turned her back and walked into the dining room where my brother was straightening his tie in the reflection of the darkened window, smiling at himself the way he had smiled at himself his entire life. I stood in the hallway of my parents' house in Etobicoke, and I did not argue. I did not slam a door. I set my bag down carefully beside the coat rack, checked the time on my phone, and breathed. 40 minutes. The man they were all waiting for would arrive in 40 minutes, and not one person in that dining room understood that he was already here, in a sense, that I had sent him, that I had written the script he was going to perform, word for word, and that every beautiful, catastrophic thing about to happen in that room had been orchestrated by the daughter they had left standing in the hallway. My father came from nothing, which he never let us forget. He had built a small property management company in the 90s out of sheer stubbornness and 2 commercial units on Dundas Street West that he bought before the market lost its mind. By the time I was a teenager, he managed 11 residential properties across Etobicoke and Mississauga. Nothing glamorous, but steady. He had the house paid off. He had a line of credit he almost never touched. He had, by any reasonable definition, made it. And then my brother grew up. To my father, my brother was not a person. He was a verdict. He was proof that the sacrifice had been worth it, that a man who came from nothing could produce something extraordinary. My brother was tall and loud and charming in the way that men who have never faced real consequences tend to be charming. He had opinions about everything and knowledge of almost nothing, and my father mistook confidence for competence every single time. The capital flowed in one direction, and it had been flowing that way since my brother was 17. The first flow was the private hockey training. $600 a month for 2 years until my brother decided hockey was beneath him. Then it was the graphic design program he dropped out of after 1 semester because the instructor, he said, did not appreciate his vision. Then it was the clothing brand, the food truck, the short-term rental arbitrage scheme that collapsed when Airbnb changed its policies, and my brother had committed to 3 sublet agreements he could not exit. My father called each of these investments. My mother called each collapse a learning experience. What they never called it was what it was, a pattern. I was the other one. I was the daughter who took out OSAP and worked the closing shift at a Shoppers Drug Mart on Bloor Street while carrying a full course load in finance at Ryerson. I graduated in 3.5 years. I passed my CFA exams on the first attempt, which fewer than half of candidates do, and I say that not to impress you, but because my father's response when I told him was to ask whether my brother could take the same exam without a degree. He was thinking, he said, of setting my brother up with something in finance, something with upside. I got a job at a boutique firm that specialized in distressed debt acquisition. The work was unglamorous and precise. When companies ran out of road, when their receivables dried up and their lenders lost patience, we stepped in and bought their obligations at a discount. Sometimes we restructured the debt and helped them survive. Sometimes we stripped the assets and moved on. It was not the kind of work that made for interesting dinner conversation, which suited me fine, because I had stopped being invited to dinner. I spent 7 years building a reputation in a field that most people have never heard of. I built a network. I built a track record. 2 years ago, my firm gave me enough autonomy to run my own small portfolio of acquisitions under their umbrella. I was 31 years old, and I was quietly, without any announcement, without any family celebration, without a single acknowledged birthday card from my father, becoming very good at what I did. My brother, at 34, was becoming the CEO of a tech startup called Northgate Analytics. He had been talking about Northgate for 8 months. He talked about it the way he talked about every venture before it collapsed, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never personally absorbed the consequences of being wrong. Northgate was building a data platform for Canadian small businesses, he explained at Thanksgiving, at Christmas. At every phone call my mother relayed to me secondhand, because my brother and I had not spoken directly in 2 years. The platform was visionary. The team was world-class. The only thing standing between Northgate and a Series A round that would make everyone rich was a bridge loan to cover operating costs until the institutional money came in. The bridge loan was $200,000. My parents did not have $200,000 liquid. What they had was a house in Etobicoke that had been paid off for 6 years, sitting on a lot now worth $1.4 million by the most conservative estimates, in a market that had done nothing but climb since my father bought it in 1998. My brother convinced them to pull a home equity line of credit, $200,000, secured against the house, at prime +1, which in the current rate environment was not nothing. My father signed the paperwork in March. My mother cried a little, and then told herself it was an investment. I found out about this not from either of them, but from my aunt, who mentioned it at a cousin's baby shower in April with the breezy casualness of someone who assumed I already knew. I drove home from that baby shower in silence. I sat in my car in the parking garage under my condo building for 20 minutes without moving. Then I went upstairs and started doing what I do for a living. Northgate Analytics was not difficult to find. It was registered with the Ontario Business Registry, and its incorporation documents were public record. The company had 2 directors, my brother and a man named Terrence, who had co-founded 2 previous startups, both of which had dissolved. Their most recent financial disclosures, filed with a private investor platform they had used to raise their initial seed round, showed a burn rate that was eating through cash approximately 3 times faster than their own projections had anticipated. Their revenue was not zero, but it was close enough that the difference was mostly symbolic. The seed investors were restless. I knew this because one of them was a fund that my firm had a prior relationship with, and their portfolio manager, when I reached out for a coffee meeting, was candid in the way that people are candid when they are quietly panicking. Northgate had missed 2 reporting milestones. The product had been delayed. The bridge loan from my brother's family, they said, was the only thing keeping the lights on. I asked what it would take to acquire the fund's position in Northgate's debt obligations. The number was smaller than I expected. I did not use personal funds. I used a numbered company I had incorporated 2 years earlier for exactly this kind of acquisition. A clean vehicle with no obvious connection to my name, unless you looked very carefully at the provincial registry documents, which no one in my family had any reason to do. The transaction closed in 6 business days. I now held Northgate's senior debt, which gave me, upon any default event, the right to appoint a receiver and take control of the company's assets. But that was not the interesting part. The interesting part was what my algorithms turned up when I ran Northgate's financials through the due diligence process that I always conduct before acquiring a debt position. I was looking for asset value, for anything recoverable. What I found instead was a set of financial projections that had been submitted to a group of angel investors 4 months earlier. These projections showed recurring revenue that did not appear in any of Northgate's actual bank records. The discrepancy was not small. It was the kind of discrepancy that has a specific legal name under the Securities Act of Ontario and the Criminal Code of Canada. My brother had submitted fabricated revenue figures to secure additional investment. I sat with that information for a long time. I thought about calling him. I genuinely did. I thought about an anonymous tip to the OSC, just dropping the file and walking away and letting the consequences find their own path. But then I remembered the baby shower and the information delivered like weather, and I thought about my father signing HELOC documents on a house he had spent 25 years paying off, and I thought about the fact that not once, not a single time in the past 7 years, had either of my parents asked me what I actually did for work. So I did not walk away. I made a call to a man named Clifford, who had been my mentor at my firm before he retired and started doing private consulting. Clifford was 62 years old, wore suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and had the specific kind of gravitas that comes from having spent 3 decades doing things very quietly and very correctly. He owed me a favor from a restructuring file we had worked together 18 months earlier, and when I explained what I needed, he said he would be happy to help. He called himself a consulting advisor to distressed portfolio companies. He had done this before. He was very good at it. I told my mother I would come to the dinner. She sounded surprised. The dinner was framed as a celebration. My brother had finalized the terms of his appointment as CEO. A significant new investor, introduced through Terrence's network, was coming to sign a letter of intent that would, according to my brother, trigger the conditions for the Series A. This was going to change everything. My mother had made a roast. My father had opened the good scotch. I wore a gray blazer and a white blouse, and no statement jewelry, because I was not there to be noticed. I arrived early enough to park 2 streets over and walk, which meant I was in the house before my brother arrived. My mother hugged me and then immediately asked me to set the table, which I did because the table needed setting, and it did not cost me anything to set it. My father came into the kitchen while I was folding napkins. He looked older than he had at Christmas. The HELOC had aged him in a way I recognized, the specific exhaustion of a person who has made a bet they are not entirely sure about and cannot take back. He looked at me and said, "Your brother is going to make us proud tonight." I said, "I hope it goes well." He picked up the scotch glass he had left on the counter and said, "You could take a lesson from him." He never let fear stop him. I finished folding the napkin. I placed it on the plate with the corner facing exactly right. I said nothing. My brother arrived at 6:45 with his girlfriend, who had been his girlfriend for 3 years, and whom my parents adored because she was pretty and laughed at everything my brother said. He came through the door with the energy of a man arriving at his own victory party. He hugged my mother for a long time. He shook my father's hand like they were closing a deal. When he saw me, his expression did not change exactly, but it did something. A flicker. He said, "Hey," like it was a question. I said, "Hey," back. He turned to my father and started talking about the investor, about the terms, about the structure of the LOI, and I went back to the kitchen because there was a salad that needed dressing, and because I had learned a long time ago that removing myself from a room was sometimes the most powerful thing I could do in it. Clifford arrived at 7:15. I heard the doorbell from the kitchen. I heard my brother's voice shift into the register he used when he was performing, deeper and more deliberate than his regular voice, the one that said, "I am a serious person who runs a serious company." I heard my father say something welcoming. I heard Clifford respond with the warm, measured authority that I had specifically asked him to deploy. I brought out the salad. Clifford was standing in the dining room in a charcoal suit, holding a leather portfolio, being introduced to my brother as though they had never met and as though my name meant nothing. He glanced at me the way a man glances at a server, brief, polite, and immediately forgetting. My brother did not introduce me. My father did not introduce me. My mother touched my arm and said, "Can you bring water glasses? There should be 4. I brought the water glasses. I stood near the sideboard while my brother performed the version of himself he had been perfecting for 34 years. He talked about the platform. He talked about the market opportunity. He talked about the team with the affection of a man describing his own reflection. Clifford asked questions, measured ones, the kind that seem like interest, but are actually excavation. At some point, my brother said, "We've already demonstrated strong early traction. We have the revenue numbers to back it up." Clifford said, "Yes, I reviewed the investor deck you circulated in February. The ARR figures are impressive." My brother smiled. He said, "We worked hard to build that foundation." Clifford opened his portfolio. He said, "Before we proceed to the letter of intent, our standard process requires verification of the revenue figures directly from your accounting system. A live export from your bookkeeping software, dated today. It's a formality, but we can't skip it for compliance purposes." The smile on my brother's face stayed exactly where it was, but something went out of it, like a light behind a window being switched off from inside. He said, "Of course, that's fine." He said it too quickly. He reached for his laptop bag. My father watched him with the expression of a man who has bet everything on a horse and is watching it approach the first fence. My mother was cutting the roast in the kitchen. I was standing near the sideboard with a water pitcher, and I had a perfect view of my brother's hands, and I watched them shake almost imperceptibly as he opened his laptop. Because here is what I knew, and he did not know I knew. Northgate's actual ARR at the time of the investor deck was somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 annually. The figure in the deck was $420,000. The difference had been entered manually into a spreadsheet that had been exported to PDF and formatted to look like an accounting software report. It was a good forgery in the sense that it looked correct at a glance. It was a disastrous forgery in the sense that anyone with accounting software experience could identify within 90 seconds that the metadata was wrong, the font rendering was inconsistent with the platform it claimed to be exported from, and the GST, HST line items did not correspond to the revenue figures in a way that any registered Canadian business's actual books would reflect, my brother typed. He did not look up. He typed for a while. Clifford waited with the patience of a man who is being paid to wait. My brother said, "I'll just pull this from our QuickBooks export." He said it to no one in particular. My father said, "Take your time, son." I refilled the water glass nearest to me. My hand was completely steady. My brother attached a file to an email. He read out Clifford's email address, the one on the business card I had prepared for him, and Clifford confirmed it. My brother hit send. He exhaled. He closed the laptop with the careful deliberateness of a man who is pretending he is not relieved. 3 seconds later, my phone vibrated once in my jacket pocket. I looked at the screen. The email had arrived. The attachment was named Northgate, Revenue, Report, Q1, Q2, PDF. I already knew what it contained. I had actually seen the original version of this file 6 weeks earlier when I obtained it through the investor disclosure process. My brother had updated the date and the header but had not corrected the metadata or the tax line formatting because he was not, at heart, a detail person. Clifford reviewed the attachment on his tablet. He nodded slowly. He said, "This is very helpful. Thank you." My brother smiled again. "The real one this time," Clifford said. "One more step, purely procedural. Given the size of the commitment we're discussing, our fund requires a collateral position while due diligence completes." He reached into his portfolio, and slid a document across the table. It was a promissory note, backed by a lien against Northgate's intellectual property and, in the event of IP insufficiency, against any personal guarantees provided by the founding shareholders. He looked at my brother and then at my father. He said, "Given that the initial bridge was funded through a personal asset, the guarantee would extend to that asset as security for the investment period, 30 days. Once diligence closes and the Series A funds, the lien dissolves automatically." My father picked up the document. He read the first paragraph. He looked at my brother. My brother said, "It's standard. This is how institutional money works. It's 30 days. I've looked at these before." My father said, "It mentions the property at..." My brother said, "Dad, please don't make this difficult in front of Clifford. I have worked for 8 months on this. This is the moment." My father's hand moved toward the pen. I set down the water pitcher. I said, "Actually, I think there are a few things you should see before you sign that." The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when someone who has been assigned the role of invisible person suddenly speaks. My brother looked at me as though I had knocked something over. He said, "Elena, this doesn't..." I said, "I'm going to need to borrow the screen for a moment." I walked to the head of the table. I plugged the HDMI cable from my bag into the laptop port on the sideboard. My father's house had a wall-mounted television in the dining room because he liked to watch the Leafs game over dinner, and it now served a different purpose. My brother said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm helping." I opened the first document. It was the provincial registry filing for the numbered company that held Northgate's senior debt. The director of record was my name. I said, "I acquired Northgate's outstanding debt obligations 3 weeks ago. I hold the senior secured position. That means in any insolvency or default event, I rank ahead of every other creditor, including the angel investors and including the bridge loan." My father said my name once, very quietly. I opened the second document. It was a side-by-side comparison. The revenue figures from the investor deck and the actual figures from Northgate's CRA business number filing, which is public record for any registered corporation. The gap was visible from across the room. I said, "The figures submitted to Secure Investment in February don't match the figures reported to the CRA. That's not an accounting error. That's securities fraud under the Ontario Securities Act, and depending on how the investor communication was transmitted, it may also engage Section 380 of the Criminal Code." My brother said, "You don't know what you're talking about." I opened the third document. It was the email he had just sent. It was the metadata panel of the PDF attachment, showing creation date, application used, and last modified timestamp. It showed the file had been modified in Microsoft Excel 2 weeks ago and exported to PDF format. It did not show the name of a QuickBooks export because it had never been inside QuickBooks. I said, "You submitted a fabricated revenue report to a potential investor in real time, in front of witnesses, by email, across provincial lines. That transmission alone is actionable." The room was completely still. My father's hand with the pen had not moved. My brother's girlfriend was looking at the wall. Clifford was looking at his portfolio. My brother said, "This is insane. You're doing this to embarrass me in front of..." I said, "I'm doing this because Dad's house is the collateral, and Dad doesn't know what he's actually securing." My father looked at my brother for a long time. Then he looked at me. He looked at me in a way he had not looked at me since I was a child, standing in front of him with a report card full of grades he didn't ask about. And I saw something move behind his eyes that I had waited a long time to see. Not pride, not gratitude, just recognition. The specific, terrible recognition of a person who understands, for the first time, that they have been looking in the wrong direction. I placed 2 documents on the table. I said, "Option 1. I refer the securities matter to the OSC, and the file goes to Crown Counsel. The HELOC becomes an unsecured personal loss, and the house is exposed through any judgment enforcement. Option 2. Northgate is restructured under my debt position. I take on the operating debt and wind down the company properly. The bridge loan is repaid from asset liquidation. Your house stays yours." My brother resigns as director. My mother had come into the dining room at some point during this. She was standing in the doorway with a serving spoon, and she said, "You cannot do this to your brother. He built that company." I said, "The company was built on fabricated numbers, and your mortgage." She said, "You have always been jealous. Since you were children, this is jealousy." I looked at my mother. I thought about every Christmas I had come home to a house where my contribution to dinner was expected and my presence was incidental. I thought about the baby shower and the way the HELOC had been mentioned like weather. I thought about every time she had referred to my work as your little job. I said, "Your house appreciates at about $60,000 a year in this market. In the time we've been standing here, it's gone up roughly $7,000. You're welcome to let that keep happening under your own roof. But if that document gets signed, it won't be your roof." She didn't say anything after that. My father picked up the restructuring agreement. He read it the way a man reads something when he is hoping to find a reason to argue and cannot find one. He read it again. His hands were not shaking anymore, which I thought was interesting. I think the shaking had been about uncertainty. Now he was certain, and certainty, even terrible certainty, is steadier than hope. He signed. My brother stood up. He said, "This isn't over." I said, "Yes, it is. You have 30 days to find alternative housing arrangements. As the debt holder, I'll manage the wind down professionally, and you'll receive the residual after obligations are cleared, if there is any residual. I'd recommend calling a lawyer before end of business tomorrow." He said, "You went behind our backs. You spied on my company." I said, "I did due diligence on a distressed asset. That's my job. You just didn't know I had one." He said something else that I didn't fully hear because I was already gathering the documents from the table, sliding them back into their folders, disconnecting the HDMI cable, and coiling it with the same care I had used to set the table an hour ago. Clifford stood, buttoned his jacket, and shook my hand. He said, "I'll follow up on the restructuring timeline first thing Monday." I said, "Thank you, Clifford. Drive safe." He nodded at my parents, who did not respond, and left. I put on my coat in the hallway. I picked up my bag. I could hear my brother's voice rising in the dining room, pivoting now from defending himself to explaining why everything was actually my fault. And I could hear my father's voice, quieter, with a quality I had not heard in it before. I did not stay to parse it. That was their conversation to have, without me. The same way every other conversation in that house had been without me for most of my adult life. My mother appeared in the hallway. She looked at me with an expression I had no clean name for, somewhere between anger and something that might, in a different family, have been the beginning of shame. She said, "You should have told us. You should have said something." I put my scarf on. I said, "I watched you pull equity from your home for a company with $60,000 in annual revenue because he told you it was worth $420. I watched you sign a HELOC in March without asking me. The person in this family who does this for a living, a single question about it. I'm not the one who failed to say something." She opened her mouth. I said, "The house is protected. That's what matters. I'll send the restructuring documents to your lawyer next week. Tell Dad to have someone review them before he signs." I zipped my coat. I said, "I've always made sure the details were correct, Mom. You just never watched me do it." I walked out through the front door into a night that smelled like cut grass and cold air coming off the lake. The street was quiet. 2 houses down, someone had left their garage light on. It cast a long yellow rectangle across the driveway, and I walked through it and past it and kept going. I did not look back at the house. 3 months later, the North Gate wind down closed. The IP assets sold to a competitor for less than anyone had hoped, which is how these things usually go. After senior debt was cleared, there was a residual of $11,000, which I had my lawyer forward to my brother without a note. The bridge loan was repaid to my parents in full from the asset proceeds. Their HELOC was closed. The lien was discharged. My father's house was his again, free and clear, the way it had been before. My father called me in October. It was the first time he had called me, not my mother relaying a message, not a group text, but his voice on my phone saying my name. He said he had been thinking. He said he was not good at certain things. He said he had read an article about distressed debt investing and realized he had not understood for a long time what I actually did. I said, "It's okay." He said, "It's not okay." We were both quiet for a moment. I said, "The house is fine. That's what I wanted." He said, "I know that now." He asked if I would come for Thanksgiving. He said my mother was making the roast again, and there would be enough for everyone, meaning just the 3 of us, because my brother had moved to Calgary in August and had not been in contact. I said I'd think about it. I went. I sat at the table, not near the sideboard, and my father poured the wine and my mother served the food, and nobody asked me to do anything except be there. It was an ordinary meal. It was the most extraordinary meal I had ever eaten in that house. Afterward, my father and I sat in the living room with tea, and he asked me about work and actually listened to the answer, asked follow-up questions, nodded when I explained the mechanics of a receivership. He did not understand all of it, but he was trying to understand, and that was new, and I let it be new without needing it to be more than it was. On my way out, he hugged me at the door. A real one, both arms, the kind that means something. He said, You always were the one who paid attention to the details. I said, someone had to. I drove home on the Gardener with the city on my left and the lake flat and dark on my right, and I thought about the version of myself who used to stand in the hallway and say nothing, and I thought about how that silence had not been defeat. It had been accumulation. Every year of being overlooked had been a year of watching, of learning the architecture of a problem before deciding how to solve it. I had not been invisible. I had been patient, which is a different thing entirely, and a much more expensive one for the people who mistook it for weakness. The city lights were very bright on the water. I did not feel like I had won. I felt like I had settled an account that had been open for a long time, and that the books were now clean, and that whatever came next would be built on something real. That was enough. For now, it was enough.